A World of Woods. Chapter 1. The Lake of Souls. A lot of people think that living in a small, sleepy town is the dream. It's not. In a small town, everyone has their expectations for what you should be. Ambitious, driven, saying all the right things. And in this small town, I clearly don't meet those expectations. I get a pass on a lot of things since the death of my dad, but I'm still treated like an outsider. So that's what I become. I sit at home and gaze into the woods wondering what is on the other side. I write stories about all the magical creatures that I would find there and the adventures I'd go on. School's alright, I'm not being bullied or anything, but I don't really get on with the other boys. I guess that's why I decided to stay at home today. I said goodbye to my mom and walked out the door, then waited for her to leave so I could sneak back in through an open window. My mom doesn't give me keys to the house. I spent the whole day writing my story, ironing out the details and detailing the complex practices of my fictional creatures and their wars. In the story, a boy like me is taken in and becomes their leader. He brings them out of the woods into the town and overthrows the council. By the end of the day, my room was filled with pieces of paper scattered all over the floor with drawings of magical creatures and strange arcane symbols. My mom burst in, daggers for eyes. "What were you thinking?" she yelled. "I wasn't," I replied in a trance. This was not the first time we had argued. Since Dad died, it was impossible to go a week without conflict. "Everyone is talking about us." She looked at me with anger that quickly resolved into sadness. Sadness is worse. She makes me feel guilty about what I've done. "Why can't you just be normal?" she asked. "Everyone else in the town just grits their teeth and works." I looked up at her. "I am normal." "Not since Dad died," she replied angrily. She looked at me with a mix of frustration and pity, and then she left. I wanted to get angry, but I couldn't. I saw her point, but at the same time I hated what she had said. She brought up Dad. That's what really annoyed me. I wanted more than ever to run off into the woods. I wanted to run off so bad that I thought up a plan. Once the last of the sun had vanished, I made my break. I slid out of the window with a small bag. I brought a few snacks, a blanket, and of course my story. I could camp out in the woods, write my story, and in the morning I would return home. In the morning my mom would find me and tell me how sorry she was for what she said. Just before I left, I went back in through the window and wrote a note so my mom would know where to find me. I left it on my bed, and then, without giving myself time to second guess, I climbed back out the window and ran down to the woods. I had been to the woods a couple times with my dad before he died, but since I had forgotten how lost you could get. All the trees towered above me like twisted giants. As I wondered where I would sleep, I heard the faint echo of singing. I thought I had imagined it, but then it came again. A warm sound hovering in the air. I followed it like a dog. I reached the lake and the sound filled the air now. I looked around. The trees on the edge leaned forward and hung their leaves in the water. I walked up to the edge and looked in. I saw glowing rocks litter the bottom and shine on the soft ripples of the surface. Bending down and looking closer, I was completely entranced. Then suddenly out of the water, two scaly arms pulled me in. When my head hit the water, I found that I was being pulled through to where the rocks should be, but instead of rocks, I was emerging from a pool. A pool almost identical to the one I had entered. I hadn't been turned around, so I couldn't figure out how this worked. I didn't have much time to think about that though. The creature that had grabbed me twisted my head sharply to look at its disfigured face. Then my arms were thrust behind my back and bound. I saw more of the vaguely human creatures around the lake. One of them had grabbed my bag and was looking through it, tossing the contents on the ground. "Help!" I screamed. Then my mouth was covered by a large, scaly hand before I could scream again. As they started to drag me away, a war cry rang out. Then arrows were flying and the monsters fell around me. I tried to escape amidst the chaos, wriggling away on my stomach, but I felt one of the creatures grab my ankles, claws cutting my skin, and it pulled me back. I kicked and screamed, but the claws only gripped tighter. Then they went limp. The head of the creature rolled along the ground and came to a stop, staring at me with a shocked expression. I rolled onto my back and someone helped me up. He looked human, but his eyes glowed bright blue with an unnatural light. "Thank you," I mused. "You won't be thanking me for long," he chuckled. Then he knocked me unconscious. When I awoke, I was in a large wooden hall with my hands chained to a wooden beam. I looked around at my captors. All of them could pass as humans without their blue eyes. I saw an odd 50 or so with swords and another 100 without, seemingly composed of royals, smiths, children, and women. But even all of them had pretty worn faces. It was quite a large hall and everyone stood around the edges. I was in the middle, and directly ahead of me sat their leader on a wooden throne. He was whispering to one of his advisors. I tested the chains around my wrists, shaking them lightly. That won't work, a voice came from behind me. I turned around. It was a girl, not much older than me, dark brown hair flowing past her shoulders. Even if you somehow managed to wriggle out of your chains, she continued, you'd be cut down before you reached the exit. Who would cut me down? I asked, motioning to all the soldiers by the sides about 20 meters away from me. They couldn't reach me in time. She lifted up her blade. I would, she answered. I noticed her eyes weren't blue like everyone else's, but a deep brown. How come? I started to ask her why this was when I was interrupted by a loud banging. I saw a final glimpse of the girl smirking at me before I looked forward. The leader was standing up, looking at me. Then he addressed the room, all in favor of sparing the outsider. Hands went up. Then he asked, all in favor of killing the outsider. And my blood froze, even though I knew it was coming. Hands went up. More than for the first question. My fate was decided. Any objections? The leader asked. Silence. I thought I was dead, but then the girl walked up beside me. I'll vouch for him, she said. A man stood up from the side. He had a long, hawk-like face with his mouth drawn into a frown. We don't have time for this now. Not when the warlocks vastly outnumber us, he replied angrily. You know better than any how dire our situation is. I know that killing him won't help us, she replied calmly, and if we keep him around, we'll have another good fighter. I heard the loud banging again of the leader's spear on the ground. Mila, as you have vouched for him, I will spare him for now, he said. Come morning his fate will be decided. I was taken to a cell and given a loaf of stale bread and a chunk of meat, but I was so hungry I devoured it. Shortly after, the girl, Mila, came to my cell. She sat down on the floor so she was eye level with me and held out a knife. They respect me, she said softly, but only so much. I don't know what will happen tomorrow. She smiled, things might get ugly. Why are you helping me? I asked. We need all the help we can get, she shrugged. She started to get up. Wait, I said, what's going on? What were those creatures that attacked me? What is this place? So many questions, she sighed, then she looked serious. I'm not from here. I am from a kingdom far south. I fled with my mother when the warlocks attacked there. Now I am forced to fight here against the very same warlocks. The warlocks attacked you by the Lake of Souls. What is that lake? I asked, confused. I was led to it by a strange song and then pulled through. She looked at me like I was crazy. Then I heard voices coming down the corridor and she slipped away into the shadows. I wished she would stay just a bit longer. I found that even after she left, I was still thinking about her. I looked down at the knife in my hand, wondering if I even had the guts to use it. I just hoped tomorrow morning wouldn't spell my death. Chapter 2. Revelations. Surprisingly, I managed a good night's sleep and awoke refreshed when I was dragged out of my cell. I was dumped on the floor of the hall, thankful that they hadn't searched me. The knife was sloppily hidden in my sleeve. Then I waited, ready to make my escape. Finally, a voice broke the silence. Where did you come from? The chief asked. From a town outside the woods, I answered casually. The chief laughed. The woods do not end, he said. They do in my world, I replied, on the other side of the Lake of Souls. The chief studied my expression, trying to figure out if I was lying, crazy, or actually telling the truth. We'll see what the seer thinks, he said finally. Vanir, Gaul, Cain. You will journey with him. Vanir was the warrior that had argued against Mila for my death. I would like to go too, Mila said. Very well, the chief replied. And if the seer says you're lying, he added, his blue eyes burning into me, I'm sure Vanir will be happy to execute you. With that we left. What did he mean by the woods do not end? I asked Mila as we walked. She laughed. Do you seriously think you'll convince any of us that you're from some other world? I looked around at the trees wondering if this was their whole world. Assuming you're telling the truth, she said, what is your world like? No warlocks. First of all, I replied, and in my world the woods have an end. She smiled. Sounds like a paradise, if you're telling the truth. She grinned at the thought of a world without warlocks. We made good progress, and I never once saw an end to the woods. Suddenly, Vanir stopped and motioned for us all to be quiet. There was talking close by amongst the trees, and as we waited it grew louder and louder as it got closer. We trod quietly away, making for the safety of a dark cave. Vanir slipped inside and then so did one of the other warriors. Mila went next and then the last warrior. I approached the entrance with caution, but the voices were getting closer and I had to speed up. Snap! I must have stepped on a branch in my haste. I abandoned all caution and dived into the cave, scraping my leg. 2 large warlocks came rushing over to the entrance of the cave. They approached our position slowly, looking for us, but we were well hidden. Even so, it wouldn't be long before they found us. Then the flash of a blade brought one of the monsters down. Vanir swung again, and the other warlock fell as well. We scurried out of the cave and ran, in case any more warlocks were on our tail. Soon we reached a large waterfall. I couldn't see it at first, but then I noticed it. A shimmer in the water. What is that in the water? I asked. This is where the seer lives, Vanir answered with a chuckle. Then he jumped into the water, followed by the 2 warriors. Before I could ask if there was another way, Mila grabbed my hand and jumped over the side, taking me with her into the cold depths below. For a split second when I hit the water, I thought I saw my own world and my mom bent over me, shaking me awake. Then the vision was gone and I stood with Mila in front of a cottage. Around us, rocky walls blocked off the world. The only light was a lamp hung above the cottage door, but that was surprisingly bright. Mila let go of my hand and knocked. An old lady came to the door. She had deep brown eyes and wore many necklaces and other ornaments. Inside, the warriors had made themselves at home on a turquoise sofa. The seer motioned for Mila and I to sit. Then she produced a long decorated knife, seemingly from the air. She made a small cut in her hand and then grabbed my hand and cut it as well before I could move it. It stung and blood oozed out and I jerked back instinctively. Stay still, the seer spoke in a surprisingly commanding tone. She laid her palm on mine and pain shot up my arm. Then I fell back dizzy. The world went black and I saw a light blue tree materialize in the darkness. The seer stood next to it. She motioned me to come over. I do not have long, she said, but while I was figuring out if you were telling the truth, I found something else. She grabbed a blue globe from the air. Be careful, she warned, there is magic in you that you do not know about. If this magic is discovered, friends may become enemies. The vision changed and we were in a large hall. The same hall I had my trial in, but it seemed to be in the past. It was prophesied that a boy of magic would come to this world, she continued, then her expression went dark, and the tribe was told that his sacrifice would bring about the destruction of the warlocks. Why would you tell me this? I asked. Because I do not believe such foolish prophecies, and I do not want to see an innocent boy killed, she answered. You must wake up now, before my blood kills you. But remember, trust no one. I jerked my hand away and woke up. Slowly my vision returned. I looked around at the 2 warriors, Mila, the seer. He tells the truth, she declared. What should we do now? Vanir asked. We shall lead him to his home, the seer answered, smiling at me. Why waste time with him? Vanir asked, frustrated. Why not keep him as a fighter? The seer turned her attention to Vanir. We do not keep children as captives, she spoke with a tone that stopped Vanir in his tracks, or we are as bad as the warlocks and damned by the gods. Thank you, I said to the seer, but I still wondered if the seer herself truly had my best intentions in mind. I wish she hadn't told me about this magic in my blood. Now I couldn't truly trust anyone. Mila gripped my hand and smiled. You all right? She asked. Yeah, I replied with a smile. You finally get to go home, Mila said, resting her head on my shoulder. I looked at her and smiled and then followed the seer out of her underwater house. While we were walking, I realized that I had just accepted this world of warlocks and magic. I never stopped to question how I had ended up here. Now as we walked, I started to question these things. What is the Lake of Souls? I asked the seer. The Lake of Souls, she chuckled, even I don't know that. It's been around longer than our whole race. I know because I inherit the memories of every human that has come before me. But I do know that the lake holds a special power. Whenever I go near it, I can feel its magic. I was walking through the woods in my world, I said. I heard singing and followed the sound to the lake. Then I was pulled through by a warlock. The seer looked back at me worried and refused to tell me any more. When I walked away from the seer, Mila came over. Do you know the sound of a warlock? She asked. No, I replied. She looked at me with a serious expression. When the warlocks attacked my kingdom far south, I was the first to hear them, she said, a low rumble of the earth that no one heard but me. I warned anyone that would listen, but nobody would. Only my mother. My father said I was crazy and hearing things. He said we had killed all the warlocks. He was wrong. Then in the distance I saw the warlocks gather. She continued, I knew that my father wouldn't get a quick death, and I knew none of the other people in the town would either. So I got my mother out, got her on a horse, and said I'd go back for something. She stopped. For what? I asked. My father, she replied. I begged him to join me. He wouldn't listen. She was crying. I saw him die. She finished her story in tears. I fled here with my mother. As we rode away, I saw my father run out calling to us. We couldn't save him. He was on fire, and he looked at me with only pity. I looked at her. She wiped away the tears. I'm telling you this because I hate the warlocks. But I like you more than I hate them, she said. I know about your secret. But you don't have to be afraid. You have power greater than any of us. Remember that. I held her gaze for a few seconds, smiling back at her before she left. It was relieving to have her as an ally. If she knew and she wasn't telling anyone, that meant she was on my side. If I needed to, I could take on the other warriors. Stop, Vanir hissed. Silence. Then we heard a rustling sound behind us. Run. He shouted. The warlocks that must have been following us gave chase. I looked back. There must have been more than 20 of them. We managed to create a large distance between us and the warlocks at first, but they had a steady pace and eventually the gap closed. Mila was the furthest back. She was rapidly losing stamina, and I could tell she would be dead if I didn't act now. It wasn't conscious, but when I felt it at my fingertips I knew what it was. A blue glow and then a large column of energy shooting back at the warlocks. It hit all of them, blowing the ground beneath their feet up in a grand explosion. I fell down dizzy. Everyone had stopped running with the threat now gone. They stared at me with wide eyes, save Mila and the seer. Do something now. Mila kept shouting. I couldn't. All the magic had been drained away in one blast. My vision was blurry and my senses numb, but I felt a tugging as my arm was forced behind my back and saw one of the warriors grab Mila. Then everything went black. Chapter 3. Utopia. I awoke in a cell. An all too familiar situation. Mila sat sulking in the other corner. Why didn't you kill them when you had the chance? She grumbled. I couldn't, I replied. I didn't have the strength to do it. She looked at me with a dark expression and then smiled. Will you be able to save us now? I looked down at my hands trying to feel the magic again, but it didn't come. Not with magic, I replied, but maybe there's another way. The plan was simple. Mila would scream that I had attacked her. When the guard entered, we would have to find a way to knock him out and take his sword. Not a very good plan, but all we had. Mila screamed, and after longer than expected, a drunk guard walked up to the cell door. He stepped in and almost instantly Mila sprung onto him like a cat. She grabbed a knife from his belt and slit his throat. She grabbed another blade he had been carrying and handed it to me. We were meant to knock him out, not kill him, I said, avoiding looking at the gruesome sight. Mila pushed me angrily. If it's us or them, it'll be them, she growled. Now let's go. We rushed out. I tried not to think about the guard. After all, Mila was right that we didn't have much of a choice. When we reached the top of the stairs, Mila pulled me into the shadows as a group of guards ran past. Then we hurried out and sprinted into the denser woodland. It was nearly night, and when I looked back I saw the whole kingdom lit up. Burning torches lined the streets and some sort of festival was starting. What are they celebrating? I asked. Your death, Mila laughed, but they'll be disappointed to find that their sacrifice has slipped from their fingers. As she said this, I saw one of the guards run out of the cell block and barrel through a crowd of people. It was a funny sight. What now? Mila asked. Where can we hide? I had an idea. I imagined a cloak that would blend in with whatever was behind it, and I drew it with my fingers. I felt the magic flow, and then I had made the fabric. As I held it in front of Mila, I couldn't see her. Cool, she said. You're really getting the hang of this magic, aren't you? It's quite simple, I said. As I wrapped her in the cloak, I just have to concentrate and direct my thoughts. I created another cloak for myself, and just for extra security, Mila and I found an overgrown patch of grass. We could hear the shouting and then see the light, but they never discovered us. Soon we had both fallen asleep. In the morning, Mila woke me and pointed to the kingdom below us. We could rule, she said softly. Rule the kingdom. I asked sleepily. With your power there would be no war, she continued. We could end it all today. I can't, I replied. I need to go back to my own world. She rested her head on my shoulder. These people need you, she said. This is life and death. I sat up. We could create a kingdom of freedom. A utopia, she continued. I looked at her and smiled. How? I asked. She held up my hand. You were born with the power to crumble nations and in their place build a world of peace. So use your power. As she talked, I was watching the bushes behind her. They moved strangely. I reached past Mila towards the bush. Then it rustled. Suddenly, Viner jumped out, grabbing Mila and knocking me to the ground. He raised his sword to finish me off, but I was able to send a bolt of magic, knocking him off balance. I tried to send another bolt to finish him, but even though his swing missed my throat, it hit my wrist instead. My hand went flying off, severed from my arm. I screamed and clutched it with my remaining hand. Viner ran off with Mila before I could stop him. If he'd known that he had just stripped me of my magic by removing my hand, he probably would have finished me off, but luckily he was too frightened to think about that. I couldn't stop him. I just lay bleeding out on my bed of grass. Then I heard footsteps. I thought it was Viner, back to finish me off. It wasn't. It was the seer. You. I hissed, remembering how she had stood and watched as Mila and I were captured. Do I deserve your hate for my neutrality? She asked. I only come to aid. I backed away holding my bleeding wrist. How? I asked, looking at the situation. You can regain your power, she said calmly, but what you choose to do with it is your decision. She held my wrist. So what do you choose? She asked. I choose to fight, I said almost in a shout. I couldn't tell if that was what she had expected or hoped for. Her expression gave nothing away, but she whispered in my ear, be careful. This much power can be used for good, but if you let it control you, you could bring about a hell. She rubbed my wrist and my hand began to grow back. I want to create a utopia, I said. A utopia in which you rule. She asked. I looked at my newly formed hand. Thank you, I said. I returned to the kingdom. No one tried to stop me. In the city center, everyone had gathered. The chief held Mila with a knife to her throat and glared at me. Try anything and I'll slit her throat, he shouted. Mila wriggled around, but he held her firmly. What do you want me to do? I asked. You know what I want, he replied. Give yourself up willingly and she will be spared. I cast away my knife and approached, a ring of guards coming out to meet me. Then I heard a sound, a low rumble in the distance. I laughed. Perfect timing, I chuckled. The chief looked back, worried. An army of warlocks came storming through the trees and toppled the gate. Then they poured in. I saw the chief drop Mila as he ran from the onslaught. I rushed over and helped her. She wasn't badly hurt and she took my hand as we rushed out of the battlefield. I was able to use my magic to stop anyone in our way and create a path for us out of the kingdom. Now's our chance, Mila laughed. We'll bring about a golden age. I looked at the kingdom. A utopia. I asked her, looking back at the kingdom from the top of the hill. A utopia. She promised. A utopia where we rule, I repeated the seer's words. I'll admit I didn't tell you the full truth, Mila said, walking up beside me. The warlocks didn't burn down my father's house. I did. I spared him from a worse fate, whatever fate the warlocks had in store. She looked at me innocently. We could create a utopia, she repeated. I looked at her. I can't. She contorted with anger, and in her anger she grabbed my sword and swung wildly at me. We could be gods. She screamed. I tried to stop myself, but couldn't. I grabbed her blade, my hand bleeding from its sharp edge, and I buried my knife into her chest. She went limp, head hung over my shoulder. I held her as I knelt down and laid her on the ground. Then I carried her to the lake. When I got there, I saw the seer knelt by the side, with a small bag. I knew you would come, the seer told me. Where else could I go? I said. Did Mila tell you? The seer asked. About her burning her own home. I guessed. No, the seer said, about the Lake of Souls. I looked at her, puzzled. It was her voice you heard in the woods, the seer continued. How? I asked. With my help, the seer said. Mila didn't burn her father's house alone. I helped her flee and convinced her to call you. I couldn't do it alone. With your help we could have ruled, but Mila wanted all the power for herself. She wanted to cut me out. What about the prophecy? I asked. Did I not tell you I don't believe in prophecies? The seer grumbled. Will you try to stop me if I want to return? I asked. Why? She replied. I couldn't stop you. Let me grieve for the dead. I laid Mila's body down and then stepped 1 foot into the lake. Then the momentum carried me down. Everything comes to an end, I heard the seer say as I fell into the cold water. Then I came out of my own world, coughing up water. My mom was kneeling by my side. I'm sorry, I said, and I hugged her as she smiled and cried. Then we walked back home.